Ocean Calls.
Hello everybody and welcome to this new series of Ocean Calls, the Euronews podcast making waves on the issues that matter to friends of the sea. I'm your host, Euronews science reporter Jeremy Wilks. There's so much to learn about our oceans, and we have a wonderful list of stories to dive into this season, like underwater noises, both good and bad, a lively debate on attitudes towards sharks, the risks to undersea cables, and the true value of marine protected areas. And we're beginning somewhere beautiful and fragile. Majestic mountains of ice that moan and crackle as if they're alive. And then...
Wow!
What was that? A beluga? A narwhal? It was the huge tail of a humpback whale disappearing into the blue-grey waters. We're in Greenland.
I like very, very much the ice. And the sound, no sound. It's quiet. It's amazing.
Tourists come to the Ilulissat Fjord in western Greenland from all over the world to marvel at this UNESCO site where the fresh ice meets the salty sea. But the next generations, our grandchildren, won't witness Greenland as these tourists experienced it, because the ice is disappearing and the waters are changing. So what is really happening in Greenland? How is climate change impacting the oceans and wildlife? And will it change things for you and me? Here to discuss that question are my two guests, Sofia Ribeiro, a senior researcher in glaciology and climate at the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland. Hello, Sofia.
Hello, Jeremy.
And Mads Peter Heide Jørgensen, professor at the Greenland Institute of Natural Resources. Hello, Mads Peter.
Hello, Jeremy.
And at the end of the episode, you'll hear an incredible Arctic Ocean experience from British South African endurance swimmer and ocean advocate Lewis Pugh, the first person to complete a long-distance swim in every ocean of the world. Now, both of you go to Greenland quite regularly. Mads Peter, does it literally look different now compared to when you first went there a couple of decades ago?
A couple of decades. I think we were talking more something like 4 decades. But yes, in many respects, we can see and feel the changes, especially when it comes to the ice situation. That has changed a lot. And also with the occurrence of new species that comes from the warmer part of the North Atlantic and that are new to the Arctic areas of Greenland.
Can you describe what you sort of saw when you went there, 40 years ago?
Well, 40 years ago, I had some field trips as a student in East Greenland where we were a little bit more risk tolerant than I would be today. At that time, you could see huge masses of polar pack ice that was moving south along East Greenland at a high speed at like several kilometers per hour. It was moving south. And it was very dangerous. If you went out there in an inflatable, you would be lost. But when I come there today, and I have had fieldwork in East Greenland in the very same area for the past 12 years, and every time when we pass in that area at the same time of the year in August, we'll see open water and very little signs of any pack ice that is drifting.
You literally look across the horizon and you don't see icebergs or lumps of ice floating.
It's virtually gone.
Wow.
From the area. So that's a big change we can see. That's in East Greenland. We also see similar changes in West Greenland, but maybe not as pronounced or so radical as what we see in East Greenland.
Sofia, let me come to you. Do you see any difference between when you first went there, which is certainly not 40 years ago, I'm guessing, and now when you go there? What do you see?
The first time I was in Greenland was only 12 years ago, and we were in southwest Greenland. So my fieldwork is typically on ships. We go on research vessels, and we go and sail in the fjords or on the shelf, where we collect water samples and sediment core samples, etc. The most striking experience of being on Greenland was when we went to northeast Greenland a couple of years ago, and there we had been following very closely satellite images of sea ice to be able to see where we could potentially go. And the changes year per year was so rapid that when we arrived there, we could actually reach all the way up to 81 degrees north because it was sea ice free. And that was not something we had seen in the satellite images we looked at. So these changes are rather rapid.
How do you feel when you're there? Because I've been up in the Arctic Circle a couple of times. It's got a special atmosphere. What's it like in Greenland?
I'm always amazed by how huge it is, how the spatial scale there is something that is really hard to conceive for us. How massive are the icebergs, the ice sheet, the distances, and how diverse it is, actually, specifically if we compare East and West.
What is this difference between East and West?
I mean, essentially, it's only the western part of Greenland that's really inhabited. One of the reasons why it's so little inhabited is also because of this ice that has kind of dominated the coastline of East Greenland for thousands of years or more. Even in the periods where we had whalers and sealers in East Greenland, they never ventured into the coast because of this ice. And if you go to southern Greenland, it's on the latitude of Oslo, and there are trees and green fields and cattle and horses. But if you go to North Greenland, there's hardly any vegetation. So it's a huge difference also north-south-wise.
Sophia, can you explain to us what's happening? We were talking about, Greenland is melting, but, with your view of a scientist, your long-term view as well, can you describe to us what's going on there generally? For somebody who really hasn't been following this, what's going on in Greenland now?
In terms of the Greenland ice sheet itself, it's melting, and we can see from historical records and reconstructions that particularly in our century, we see some massive change in runoff, so in how much meltwater is leaving the ice sheet, starting actually after the 1990s. The Arctic is warming at a rate that is at least 3 to 4 times faster than the global average. So when we talk about Paris Agreement or 2 degrees warming, we are actually looking at 6 to 8 degrees warming in the Arctic. And this is due to this amplification of global warming in the Arctic. We are seeing quite drastic changes that are both ice sheet melt, glaciers are also calving and melting at a faster rate, and the sea ice is disappearing. So we're now looking into potentially having a summer free from sea ice in the Arctic Ocean within a couple of decades from today.
Is it the case that the precipitation has changed there, that you've gone from snow to rain, or is it you've actually just got less precipitation overall as well?
Precipitation is one of the enigmas still. We know very little about precipitation. What we know is that there seems to be an increase in precipitation, but it's not only rain. Some of the changes we see are changes in moist balance. For example, a very interesting ecosystem that we study and that Mads Peter has also been working intensely with is this polynyas that form on the west coast and the east coast of Greenland that are basically areas of open water surrounded by sea ice. And these are also bringing moist into the surface. So the more open water we have, the more moist comes and will change.
So you mean that the air is more humid now? There's more humidity in the air?
Exactly. Yeah. So these are affecting precipitation by changing the amount of moisture in the air locally in the coastal regions.
Did you know that one of the reasons for the increasing melt is the presence of blooming pigmented algae on the surface of Greenland's ice? It actually makes it slightly darker, meaning it absorbs more heat from the sun.
Mads Peter, what's happening in the sea there? What are the changes we can see in terms of the animals that are there? Who's arriving? Who's leaving?
Well, we can see, for instance, in this area in southeast Greenland that we talked about, that is now losing the monumental amount of sea ice it used to have. This area is now has open water in the summertime, and a lot of several North Atlantic species, more so-called boreal species that like to live in water temperatures, they are moving into this area. They would never venture into this ice-covered area before, but since now it's open water, they can go in there and they can feed on fish stocks that are also moving towards the north and along the coast there. For instance,
Can you give us some examples then of what's sort of coming in now that you didn't see before?
Yeah, a couple of obvious examples that anybody goes to the area could see is, for instance, a large number of fin whales or humpback whales, because you can easily see them. It's a new thing that we have thousands of fin whales and thousands of humpback whales on the coast of East Greenland. They haven't been there for the past 120 years since the first recordings of life from that area was made.
And they're turning up because there's sources of food there that weren't there before, right? Or because the ice is gone? Is it kind of, or is it both?
It's both effects, because at the same time as the ice is disappearing, the sea temperature is also increasing, as it is all over the North Atlantic. So it's an inflow of warm water that has also triggered the inflow of new fish species. Some of them is of extreme commercial interest. For instance, the mackerel suddenly appeared in East Greenland around 2012 and gave rise to a huge fishery that was of great economical importance. They're now gone from the area, but they moved to other parts of the North Atlantic. But after the mackerel also came bluefin tuna, where we had the first catches here in 2012.
So you've got bluefin tuna coming up and swimming around Greenland.
Yeah, you can see that sounds completely ridiculous, I agree. But you can see that that's an illustration of the magnitude of the changes we are experiencing in this area. I think most people would say, if I said there are tunas in Greenland, they would say you're lying. But,
I was going to say, how did people react? I mean, how did you react when you saw that? You must have thought it was crazy.
Completely surprised, and it's unprecedented, because they have neither mackerel or tuna have been seen in Greenland in the past.
So you've talked about these animals that are arriving there, these species that we now see in southern Greenland that weren't there. What about those who were there before, who loved the ice? Where have they gone?
Well, we can see that, for instance, the narwhal, that is a typical Arctic species that doesn't like water temperatures above 2 degrees and definitely avoid all areas with Atlantic water. They are moved north, and they are no longer found in southeast Greenland. And also the walrus that could live there, it's not so temperature dependent, but it likes to drift on the sea ice. They are also reduced in numbers because there's less ice that's drifting along that coast.
So have those populations really suffered, or have they just kind of moved house?
We don't really know if they just disappeared or if they have moved north, because at the same time as there's been climate change, there's also been hunting of these animals, and to some extent that has exaggerated the situation, especially for the narwhals. But at least in this very southern part of East Greenland, the narwhals, they're gone, and it's definitely because of the climate change. I mean, you can imagine an area where you have a typical Arctic species as a narwhal swimming around. At the same time, there are dolphins moving in, because there are also lots of dolphins now on this East Greenland coast, and killer whales and pilot whales. And that's these species, they don't live together normally in any other parts of the world. So just by the simple kind of contact or observation of dolphins in the area, you know that something has changed dramatically.
Who's the boss in that sort of scenario? Because you've got a lot of top predators they wouldn't like to mix. Who comes out on top?
Yeah, of course, the killer whale is the boss, but the top predators are there anyway because of the fish stocks, and the killer whales, they will go after minke whales, for instance, or seals. And also now.
Question to both of you: how permanent, I suppose, are these changes that have come in now? Is this the new normal?
I think that it's quite irreversible. That this is something that will not go back. And I guess Sophia also has an opinion about that.
Yes, I do. Yes, I think, for example, ice sheets are extremely slow at responding. So, for example, for the Greenland ice sheet, we already know that regardless of our emission pathways, regardless of what we do from now on, there's already a committed loss of equivalent to about 0.3 meters of global sea level rise. We've put something in motion that we cannot very quickly stop. The Arctic sea ice as such, it's actually one of the components that is most rapidly, in terms of historical timescales, responding. So there's still a chance, according to the latest IPCC reports and model projections, that if we were to stay under 2 degrees global warming, we might keep some of the multi-year sea ice and we might be able to actually recover it relatively quickly. But for the ice sheet, it's a whole other story. I mean, the ice sheet is still in some ways responding to the last ice age, and it will be responding to this anthropogenic warming for decades and centuries to come.
But do you think that the ice we have seen in East Greenland, that has a chance to come back?
If we keep the 2 degrees increase in global warming, probably not, yeah. But if we stay below 2 degrees and then slowly start decreasing the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, then sea ice could actually recover rather quickly.
What's actually happening? You talked earlier about this fresh water that's coming off from the land, from the glaciers melting away. How is that impacting the marine environment just around the coast of Greenland?
The glaciers that are terminating on the sea, so they are marine terminating, when they are melting from below, this fresh water that is being released into the ocean is actually coming at depth. And because it's fresh water and it's lighter, it will move up. And as it moves up towards the surface of the ocean, it brings with it, it entrains some of the bottom waters. And these bottom waters are very rich in nutrients that are critical for the phytoplankton. That is basically the base of the food webs in the system. When we have land terminating glaciers, so glaciers that are sending fresh water towards the surface of the ocean, then the effect can actually be the opposite, because you create a lead of fresh water at the top of the ocean that prevents this mixing, and the meltwater is typically not very rich in nutrients, so this will limit productivity.
So there are some areas, in fact, where the situation for nature, for wildlife, for biodiversity is actually improving because of the melting. Is that what you're saying?
There are areas where we see an increase in productivity, where marine terminating glaciers are melting, yes. If we look ahead and we imagine that these glaciers will retreat onto land, then this effect will be turned off.
We've sometimes in the past and in previous seasons of Ocean Calls talked about really significant changes in the whole Atlantic system with this kind of conveyor belt of heat from the equator going up towards the north, that might be slowing down or changing. What evidence can we see about that around Greenland at the moment?
Well, one thing we are worried about is, of course, that there will be complete shutdown of this meridional overturning circulation, as it's called, this conveyor belt effect where the Gulf current is moving north and dipping down in the deep water and returning. And that's what generates such a nice climate in northern Europe. And if that stops, the climate will change in northern Europe and be a lot colder. There are some statisticians that predicts that could happen within the next 30, 40 years.
Yeah, when you see a change quite rapidly, you're talking about a sort of a change that could happen in my lifetime.
Yeah, we've reached a tipping point where there could be a shutdown of this overturning circulation.
When you look much further back into the past of Greenland, which you're doing, and I'm sure some of the researchers around you are doing as well, what can you learn about possible futures of Greenland, actually, by looking a long way into the past?
I am very interested in a period of time called the Holocene thermal maximum, which was about 8,000 to 6,000 years ago, depending where you are in Greenland, where the temperatures were higher than our pre-industrial baseline, and where the ice sheet was smaller than today. So in many parts of Greenland, we can see traces of the ice having been retreated more than it is today. Something that is very challenging to reconcile, though, is that we are now at, 420 ppm CO2. And if we want to find a past analog for this type of CO2 levels in the atmosphere, then we have to go all the way back to 3.6 million years ago.
And sea levels at that time with the CO2 concentration that we've got now would be, 15, 20 meters or more higher than they are now.
Yes, they were much higher than today, yeah.
Did you know that Greenland is actually the world's largest island, with almost 80% of the landmass covered by an ice cap? It has a population of just over 56,000 people, and has very few roads outside the towns, meaning most people get around by boat, plane, helicopter, snowmobile, or dog sled.
We've been preparing this podcast and having discussions with various different people, and some of them have been talking about some of the economic opportunities actually in Greenland as well. And I think it would be interesting to talk about that because, of course, we can see that there's a change in the fisheries. There has been a boom in the fisheries there as well. We also know that Europe is looking for different sources of resources. It wants to try and be independent from China or from Russia for particular kinds of things, and Greenland might be the sort of place where they could be able to extract those. What do you think about that and the process that's underway of melting could make that more possible, a little bit more cost effective to do? Mads Peter, what are your thoughts on those kinds of issues?
Well, I think the most immediate change in the economy will be related to the fishery. And since Greenland has always had such an exposed position in the ocean, there's also a high degree of adaptability in the population that lives in Greenland. They've already done that to a large degree with the mackerel resources that wasn't in East Greenland for a while. And they've done that in the past also with the Atlantic cod that used to be very abundant in West Greenland. It's not really abundant at the moment now, but if it came back in the amount of biomass they had in the 60s, then it would be the world's largest fishery for Atlantic cod, and that's a very valuable fish. So it'll have a tremendous economical impacts on society. On the other hand, some of the ability to hunt species on the ice or travel on the ice and hunt very Arctic-related species like narwhals and belugas and walrus and bowhead whales, they will probably be reduced.
I want to come to our conclusion now, and I'm thinking, for me here in Europe, and for other listeners here in Europe, what are the real implications for us of Greenland melting away?
I think the biggest risk is the sea level rise, but also the risk of the shutdown of the Gulf current system in the North Atlantic, to make it quite simple.
So the sea level rise, and then is a possibility that this nice heat pump from equator up to the Arctic should stop, and then in which case the weather actually gets colder for me here in Europe.
Yeah, you'll feel it directly.
I was just the other way reading this study that was linking, melting Greenland with risk of malaria in West Africa versus South Africa as the rain belt shifts, towards south, etc. So I think that at this point, we should not think about our massive polar ice sheet as something remote. I think we are really changing the climate system in a way that we cannot at this point predict. There will be impacts that are much beyond sea level rise and thermohaline circulation.
That's interesting. You're talking about basically the melting of Greenland fundamentally being part of a huge change in weather patterns that we have around our planet.
Exactly.
As well as the sea level rise, which we know is coming, whatever happens, because that's locked in with the warming that's already in place because the reaction time is slow. And then also possible changes that might mean it actually ends up getting colder, ironically, in Europe than it was before. When you listen to all of that, Sophia, how do you feel?
I'm concerned, but something that I think is quite important is that I'm kind of tired of hearing the slogan "Save the Planet." I think that's a grave misconception of where our concerns should be. I think we should really shift our focus to, save humanity or save humanity's ideals or lifestyle, or if we want to keep ideals as justice and equality and freedom and health and some sort of balance with nature, then we need to shift our focus. I'm concerned mainly when I see people detaching themselves from what's happening with nature, from what's happening with biodiversity, and they feel that they have a choice to care or not about it. We don't have a choice.
Mads Peter?
No, I agree. I think the planet will survive, and nature will also survive. But the thing is that that both the planet and the nature around us will transform into something that is less agreeable to human life and less acceptable for our current culture.
Well, thank you. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you, and I feel like I've built up a picture of what Greenland looks like and what it's like for the animals there as well. So thank you, Sofia Ribeiro from the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland, and Mads Peter Heide Jorgensen from the Greenland Institute of Natural Resources. Thanks very much for being with us on Ocean Calls.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome.
And now let's sail straight into Ocean Favourites, the part of the podcast when a well-known person tells us all about their favourite ocean experience. And this time, we'll hear from Lewis Pugh, an endurance swimmer, an ocean advocate, an extraordinary athlete who swam everywhere from a glacial lake on Mount Everest to the coast of Antarctica. And here is his tale of swimming across the North Pole.
My name is Lewis Pugh. I'm an endurance swimmer and the United Nations Patron of the Oceans. Come round about 2003-04, I felt the need to stand up and talk about the health of our planet and what we were doing to our oceans. I was seeing our oceans change and change very, very quickly. And so I decided to do a really big swim, and that was to sail all the way to the North Pole and do a swim there. So, this is a place which has been frozen over for millennia. But I wanted to go there, actually to the North Pole, and do a swim across an open patch of sea to graphically show world leaders this is what is now happening to our planet. You can even swim across the North Pole. And we need to take this very, very seriously. The water is minus 1.7 degrees centigrade, so it's below zero. And no human had ever done a swim anywhere close to this temperature before, so we just didn't know what was going to happen. But I was so determined to do this swim. I remember standing on the edge of the ice at the North Pole and looking out over this dark black water. And I had the worst possible thought you could have. I thought to myself, if things go horribly wrong now, how long is it going to take for my frozen corpse to sink to 4.5 kilometers to the bottom of the ocean? Which is about the worst possible thought you can have. And just to explain, I'm not going to do this swim in a wetsuit or a dry suit. I'm doing this swim in just a Speedo, a cap and goggles.
Alrighty.
The first thing that strikes you is just how cold it is. The chilling winds. You're at 90 degrees north. Everything around you is south. You're standing at the top of the world. I'm standing on the sea ice. I'm looking out across this open patch of sea. It's completely black. The Russians call the Arctic Ocean the Black Ocean. I've swum in blue water and brown water and green water, almost in red water sometimes, but nothing which is completely black. And when you start swimming across the North Pole, I could see my hand move past my goggle, and then I take a full stroke, and as I take that stroke, my hand virtually disappears. That's how dark it is. It is the most hostile place you could imagine. You go through these sort of stages during the swim. The first is fear, or not even fear, terror. You dive in, and then within a minute or two, it's gone from fear to regret, and then you're asking yourself why on earth you are here, and then it moves from regret to pain, and then it's getting colder and colder and colder, and the cold grips itself around you like a vice. And so it's very, very difficult to take a proper swimming stroke. You start beginning to slap the water, your muscles are not operating properly, and then it moves from this pain to utter desperation. And then the swim is over, you get out the water and you dry yourself off quickly, and then you get yourself warm, and then you get a hot chocolate inside you, and it moves from desperation to relief. So I undertake swims in places where I can shine a light on what is happening to these places and then try and get them protected afterwards.
My thanks to Lewis Pugh for that moving story of courage and determination. The Ocean Calls podcast is created by ocean lovers here at Euronews for ocean fans around the world, and I'm your host, Euronews science reporter Jeremy Wilks, and this series is produced by my colleagues Naira Davlashyan and Natalia Olsner. The theme music is by Gabriel Dalmasso. Our editor-in-chief is Sophie Claudet. The Ocean Calls podcast is made possible by the European Commission's Directorate General for Maritime Affairs and Fisheries. You can find out more about our guests by following the links in the description. To create this episode, we used audio from AFP Video Reports. You can listen to Ocean Calls on Apple, Spotify, Castbox, or anywhere you listen to your podcasts. For more information, go to our website, euronews.com. And while you're there, please have a look at Ocean, our sister TV series. It's beautiful. Head over to euronews.com/ocean and follow world news from a European perspective on euronews.com.